my work I had with, whoops, sure. No, that's okay. I have two questions that I'm interested in. One is, how do biophilic and biophobic practices build the experiential foundations of human-plant relations in urban and urbanizing areas in the US? So urban and urbanizing could be like from center city all the way out to the urban edges, even rural areas, because they provide important, ecosystem services and other products that, support urban life. And people who live in cities, suburbs, they go out to maybe spend part of the year at a cabin or recreation in rural or wild areas. And also biophilic is, of course, our affinity towards nature. You might suspect that some of the work with like Stephen Kellert and E.O. Wilson, and who had a book that they co-edited about the biophilia hypothesis. And then biophobic is probably pretty easy to guess. That would be sort of fear or unfavorable practices towards the web of life. And so I'm really interested how these biophilic and biophobic practices contribute to, very broadly, the sixth extinction in the Anthropocene. And I'm sure you are all well versed in the sixth extinction, especially the famous book by Elizabeth Colbert, where she interviews well-known ecologists, kind of different angles on the sixth extinction. So this biophilic triggering event is really that kind of broad theme of disconnection of people and plants. And really this idea, very broadly, the sixth extinction has reshaped the experience of urban nature in the United States. And when we get down in a little bit more detail, these biophobic practices have caused unprecedented destruction of plant communities and biodiversity throughout the United States for hundreds of years. And we could also call this the process of colonization. And the removal and pushing out of plants to the margins of people's lives has caused, really generations of Americans to be disconnected and fragmented interactions with plants. Oh, and I call this the unmaking of urban landscapes. And so really a visual example of this would be, our kind of common suburban landscapes that we see where there's, very large areas of space used for parking, automobile dominated societies in terms of design and planning, more kind of a landscape, consisting more of biotic homogenization, the reduction of native plant communities, but also the biodiversity that's related to them and the web of life. And when we think about this biophobic disconnection of people from plants, it goes by quite a few names in the literature. It goes by plant blindness, extinction of experience, nature deficit disorder. And if we think about it, this is actually a photograph of a sign at a rest stop south of the Twin Cities. Basically, I almost think of it like a memorial plaque to the big woods, because it details the great extent of it. But then you just see the little remnants, and it is what it is. But I think it's a sign of this kind of biophobic practices that have accumulated over time, where we have to have the plaques rather than actually seeing the big woods in our daily lives. And that's one of many different types of native plant communities that we have here around the Twin Cities. As we know, it's actually quite a biodiverse area because of the kind of the northern boreal forest that kind of touches the northern part of the suburbs and into Minneapolis a little bit with all the bogs. But then we have all these also the eastern temperate forest that we have, known as the big woods here, kind of its westernmost extent. And then also the prairies and oak savannas and oak, and oak barrens that are kind of very common here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so actually, an ecotone of a lot of different types of plants and animals and the web of life. And so this extinction of experience is really not really, most people aren't really aware of it. And given this, for some populations, it's been felt more acutely, and there are people working more consciously to improve human-plant relations or relationships by developing cultures more oriented towards plants. So these are the more biophilic practices. You could say a more biophilic culture. And so they're also looking to improve the understanding about human-plant relations. So you can see, you know, an important group here would be scientists and natural resource managers who really have that strong knowledge and awareness of the web of life and are communicating its, kind of its destruction and the need to protect it. But there's also a lot of lay people who are experts in their local environments, and it could be master gardeners or master naturalists, also people who just enjoy bird watching or recreation or like planting plants in their garden. It really comes in a lot of different forms. But in a sense, if we look at these kind of plant conscious cultures in cities, they do show up in the past couple decades in certain ways, like in the Great Plains, or you could say in the Midwest, like in Chicago. There's this idea of, well, you don't always need to have a big lawn, that you can integrate in native plant communities. This is a photograph of a famous conservation design subdivision northwest of Chicago. It's done by Conservation Design Forum, and they're specialists in kind of prairie and native plant restorations, also in their hydrology. And so here we have like a bioswale, but also different kind of, I guess you could say, homeowners' expressions of their values about what kind of front lawn or even, side yards or back yards, what they should look like. And also we have examples of prairie restoration in Chicago, where there's been specific practices of ecological restoration to restore tall grass prairies, based on evidence-based practices and science for land stewardship on public land. So what's interesting about the plant conscious cultures is that it includes private and public land. And for the conservation of species, the areas of private land are actually quite important and kind of a supplement, I guess you could call a conservation matrix for plants and biodiversity. And there's some really distinctive characteristics of these plant conscious cultures. You could call conscious care, but these are some of the factors that influence human-plant interactions: species, space, visibility, materials, practices, and awareness. And, and there's a paradox with this extinction of experience, because often the most distinctive characteristic of US cities is a moderate to high level of greenness, with immaculate lawns, shade trees, bold flowers. Of course, we call this beautification, very nice to look at. But sometimes when you look at photographs of it and look at the very high levels of space consumption for lawn and, for like, maybe here's like a boulevard landscape, it always leads to question, could we be doing something more here? And something more that doesn't necessarily mean, costing more money or heavier maintenance. It just means a way of doing things differently, but that hasn't really been necessarily adopted across the culture of the United States. You have pockets of it, but you could see some of these areas could easily be converted to prairie areas. And there's plenty of examples of where that's been done, or other more, I guess, called sprawlscapes. This is in St. Paul, but, kind of large boulevard landscapes like that. And yet this paradox is also based on an illusion of greenness, illusion of species, space, and visibility that hides the true state of human-plant relations. The use of plants here is not really as living organisms, maybe respecting them as that and for their value of existence, but more like inorganic construction materials, or just invisible filler and background to be forgotten and ignored. Or maybe like for lawn, it's a cheap alternative. And for the creation of these vast sprawlscapes, there is a price to be paid. This overconsumption of space, especially with automobile dominated societies, and probably some planning in communities that kind of encourage that as the standard, and also the biotic homogenation of landscapes. And so after all this unmaking of urban landscapes, we can think about that it has triggered a response with biophilic roots to it. And this is the culture of remaking urban natures. Defining the culture of remaking urban natures, it has a few characteristics. One is that there's an emotional resistance to the extinction of experience in specific groups, and this has increased over time. And you can think of these groups like nature conservation and urban agricultural enthusiasts. Of course, scientists who are, well educated in this. And there's also the interest in more conscious use of space and species in new landscapes through the process of remaking old ones. And the third characteristic is more conscious use of materials, practice, and understanding that are integrated into the remaking process. And so it's thinking about also these other two characteristics. One, that remaking urban natures creates different types of urban nature. And in some academic literature, they would call it urban natures because there's many different types. And these kind of different types have emerged in yards and neighborhoods, coming from different visions and values about human-plant interactions. So the physical landscape we see, the structure, its pattern or form, can influence function and vice versa. Or you can think of process or behavior. The fifth characteristic, alternative interpretations of human-plant relations, has moved from the conventional aesthetic of sprawlscape, like in the photographs I showed you, to something that's more complex, multifunctional, multicultural, mosaic of diverse plant communities and biodiverse landscapes. So our typical park landscape of lawn and trees and maybe recreational areas has become more diverse because people who live in cities or suburbs want other activities there. For example, community gardens, or it could be introduction of more indigenous oriented landscapes, or different types of active recreation or passive recreation, different designs of recreation centers, picnic areas. It's really pretty complex. And here we see some different examples of this kind of plant conscious culture. You saw that photograph up in the upper left of the conservation design subdivision, and then the prairie restoration in the kind of upper middle. But then we have examples of, like artistic approaches where it's rethinking or maybe showing contradictory relationships or maybe more symbiotic relationships, such as the gutter that starts gathering water, but with the little plants in it. That was done by an artist in Seattle. In the middle there is, whoops, go back, is an image of the High Line in New York. On the upper right and kind of middle right, those are green alleys and hillside slopes in San Francisco. And in the lower right, that's, I guess you would call it village homes in Davis, California, where it's used more sustainable design practices. They're really, you're looking at the front yards there are actually trails with kind of common open space. So there's not a lot of yard area. And in the lower center area, these are some gardens that some in the parks of Chicago. And actually they're community gardens. And then on the lower left is the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. And so my study questions were really looking at how does the culture of remaking urban natures create these different visions and types of urban nature in yards and neighborhoods through the biophilic practices and understanding human-plant relations. And so one question might be, how do these ideas connect to the academic literature in the ecological sciences and plant conservation? So here's some of them, some I had mentioned. They're quite interesting, posing questions like, are humans and ornamental plants a form of mutualism? Or maybe you've come across E.O. Wilson's Half-Earth book and, the Braiding Sweet Grass by Kimberly Wall Kimmer. And also thinking about, how can we have a different type of environmental ethics too? If we think a little bit at a different variation of that research, a little bit more in public health. You can imagine ideas about vitamin G or green, and also the nature dose. And they're in the public health and active living literature, they're very interested in this idea, can we define a nature dose? So like if there's a prescription, you go to the doctor and get it filled at a drugstore. Well, could one day doctors write a prescription based on experiences of nature? And, you know, it's a very tantalizing idea. It will take more research and application to figure this out, but probably we know when we go out to experience nature, it does have a way of helping us with stress recovery and helping put any problems we might have in perspective, and we feel better. And that's that kind of biophilic experience. And so, you know, what kind of lessons for ecologists and natural resource managers about biophilic practices that you could learn from remaking urban natures? So I have 3 of them for you to remember. One is that this is an alternative way of understanding the biophilic human-environment relations. And so I talk a lot about nature, but nature is a social construction based on a society's attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors. And so really, we want to think about that connection to the physical environment. And, you know, that there is a changing dynamic of human-plant interactions, and they can, over time, become more biophilic or more biophobic. And there's also a dichotomy occurring in concepts such as human coupled systems and social ecological systems. There's a little bit of dualism there. And so I think this perspective is more a bit of a hybrid or a little bit more non-dualistic. Some people might call this a relational perspective. And the remaking process as interventions use people's affinity to plants as a key mechanism for understanding the hybrid qualities of human environment relations. Lesson 2, greenness in cities is a complex phenomenon with many layers to understand. Some of you may have read literature or articles or books about this. It's really become more in the foreground in the past 10 to 15 years, that, you know, people are attracted to greenness, and it has contributed to a distinctive appearance of how American cities and suburbs look. Yet this greenness can be a veneer for deeper troubles and frayed relations and biophobic practices among plants and people, and biodiversity such as biotic homogenization associated with sprawlscapes. More conscious use of space and species exists in the remaking process. So alternative pathways and conceptions of greenness can emerge organically in cities. I think for professionals and experts, the question is, how can we cultivate those and help to reinforce these positive feedbacks in the landscapes we see and with people's relations with plants and biodiversity? It's a very interesting question, intriguing. And the third lesson is we want to move away from the museumification of nature as the only way to know human-plant relations. Paul Gobster, who is a social scientist and landscape architect, wrote a paper about the museumification and restoration projects in parks, and that it could potentially limit people's experience of nature. And this process can cause people to experience landscapes and plants and biodiversity more as static objects in a museum. And in many ways, that this kind of museumification of nature reinforces the idea that landscapes are frozen, that they can't change over time and space with specific or evolving management and maintenance practices. And actually, I think that's one of the most complex things to teach people, to understand this type of systems thinking and understanding the system they live in more. And because it involves influencing and changing people's attitudes, values, and beliefs and behaviors. There's also an idea that the remaking process allows multiple layers and types of urban natures to coexist in the city, representing pluralistic biophilic visions about nature and plants that create a multifunctional, multicultural landscape mosaic. And in conclusion, we can go back to that original slide about that biophobic triggering event, this disconnection, and looking at the unmaking of urban natures, linking broadly to the context of the Anthropocene and the sixth extinction. and the two questions I had with my work. And, you know, the aim is really to address the longing for better human-plant relations or human biodiversity relations. And if you would like to contact me to talk more about the unmaking and remaking of urban natures, I really enjoy you contacting me. There's my email and my Twitter handle. And I want to thank the Provost Imagine Fund and the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Minnesota for supporting this research. Thank you. Any questions?
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'll monitor the questions.
Yes.
I forgive the fact that I'm going to requote an article that I read, probably very poorly, but I recently read an article that was discussing sort of the carbon footprint of urban agriculture versus like rural agriculture. It talks about the fact that they're in sort of large urban agricultural settings, like commercialized urban agricultural settings, there was actually, this is specifically for produce, there was actually a bigger carbon footprint of the urban ag work than there was of doing like a traditional rural and then transported ag. I'm curious if you've thought about sort of those carbon footprints of sort of these like greening urban landscapes. Are there cases where it's an obvious win to change the way we think about greening urban landscapes towards this more biophilic, less biophobic version? And are there cases that you know of where there's obvious, like you'll pay the price in carbon footprint, for example, or something else if you transition towards this sort of new urban landscape?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say that, you know, looking with that landscape lens, there's going to be many ways to consider it. And I think looking at just carbon footprints, they're very important. And I guess you could say, how do we, I guess the question is, what's the outcome that's desired? You know, if it's looking at just carbon footprints, it may not be great, but it depends on the scale looking at it. And, you know, if you can have people starting to, like, let's say, convert their lawns to, you know, more like gardens with vegetables, they're going to be the inputs and outputs are going to be different. And so there's always a price there. And I guess the question is, how do you weigh that? I don't have an easy answer to that, but it's interesting to think about, you know, if we say we want better human-plant relations, is that, you know, most important to encourage that and offer people employment and things like that, like maybe in urban ag versus more traditional agriculture, like in rural areas. And so, because it does benefit from that economy of scale. And so, yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have a simple answer to that. I think more research is needed to decide, you know, how that would work out, and saying, how could maybe urban agriculture reduce its carbon footprint in something like that, in certain practices and things. And so just because something is biophilic doesn't mean it may have a tiny carbon footprint, or, and it's a good point, I think.
Thank you for the discussion.
Yeah. Yes.
Good question. So I study birds in urban areas, and specifically birds like hitting windows. And so, you know, when thinking about greening urban spaces and using native plant, you know, amalgamations and that sort of thing, my thought is like, there's been studies that show that native plants and stopover habitat for birds can get reflected in windows and increase sort of window strikes. Is there any thought when you're considering, you know, these urban landscapes and native plantings, like how are you incorporating current buildings into those landscapes or future buildings?
Yeah, I think right now with architects, and that's not my field. I just know a little bit about the idea, but I know they're trying to consider the type of glass they put in. So it's can reduce those bird strikes. I think the good thing is that there's more consciousness in awareness in the architecture community and also landscape architecture about the bird strike ideas. And, you know, like trying to turn out, you know, the lights when there's the big migrations coming through. And I live near the Mississippi River, and so you know, and so I see, you know, warblers when they come through in the spring and in the fall, and also just the diversity of species, bird species that come through. And so, but I think with like residential areas, you know, it's a little bit different situation, not as much glass as, let's say, like skyscrapers and things like that. But still that glare can be an issue because I've seen birds run into like my windows before. Not very frequent, but all of a sudden you hear a thump, and it's like, was there glare there, or was the bird, you know, just maybe sick or something? You don't really know. And once I had a robin who kind of kept doing this. I think he saw his reflection in the glass and thought it was another bird because he would peck at the glass and stuff. So, but I think, you know, looking at the skyscrapers or just even, you know, kind of low rise building and the type of glass they have, you know, there's a serious problem with bird strikes. And, you know, it affects, you know, if we knew all the birds and the species and saw them and their impacts, we would be really sad. And I think it would help people to change the practices faster. So. Yes.
One of the things you were talking about that really resonated with me is like the idea of how much space, like the sprawl state ideas. And I come from like the farther Morehead area, which I feel like culturally feels like a few years behind down here. And so when I talk to my parents and their friends and everyone, like they all take great pride in having huge, beautiful, pristine, perfectly cut grass lawns. And I just think that the idea, like, it feels to me such a hard sell that like this isn't like how it should be, and that like they do these beautiful pristine road verges and everything that are just like, perfectly cut and trimmed. And so I'm just curious, like if you or others you know have been doing work on how to like sort of strike up a balance between like a less biophobic atmosphere when there's such a strong like American cultural tie to like the white picket fence and the perfect.
Yes, and that is an entryway, and people will be very proud. And what they're doing to their lawns is actually biophilic in a sense. They're carefully tending it and doing all of those things. It's just we need more awareness about what is it that they're really doing, that it's more of a monoculture. And you know, so I have to say that's, you know, kind of the convention in American society. And you know, I grew up in a place where we had a yard, but it was kind of full of weeds. It got mowed weekly, but it was not, it was, you know, it had a lot of, you know, the species, you know, like, you know, little like veg things in it. But I guess you could say, you know, could you get people to use less sprays and, you know, pesticides and herbicides? You know, I think that would be a plus. Even the wildlife friendly yards, even if it's just park or a watershed friendly yard with rain gardens, you know, that does help to shift things some. And of course, it doesn't mean you can't have lawn, because lawn has some practical functional purposes to it for like play and picnic areas and sporting for recreation. It's just like how much lawn we have, you know, like the big boulevards where you could almost say they probably, that to me is like, yeah, they could probably save some money with, you know, with prairie. And that has, you can know in the park systems of the Twin Cities that shows up, and they don't have to mow as often. And then for parks departments with really, you know, with budget constraints, that's kind of an obvious look. So it's not like the whole landscape can change to being, you know, native plants and all that. But I think over time, can we help people be more aware to maybe influence their choices around what is biophilic? Because that greenness is known to, you know, when people want the lawn and with scattered trees, that is known in the environmental psychology literature as being good for stress recovery and working and gardening and things. So it on the surface, it looks like it works, but when you get down into the ecology, that's where, as you all know, you're a ecology very aware audience, that's where the issues come up. And so that's where concern for pollinators and birds, those are all natural entryways to come in and to have discussions to say, can we get people to adopt and think about that? And, you know, there have been studies that look at spatial adjacency, you know, for these kinds of practices, and it can influence neighbors. And so it's kind of a slow process probably of diffusion, but it can, you know, that private land can be an important influence in the matrix. And so there's a lot of nonprofits who work on these areas who have, for the past few decades, probably trying to increase awareness. And I think it's gotten better. And, you know, sort of understanding what is, you know, kind of a more, like a better, more biophilic society and something that's more relational. You know, we got a long ways to go, but I think, you know, being open, that's why I think it's good to be open to different cultures and their conceptions of nature, because it opens up, discussions like raiding sweetgrass, you know, helping to raise awareness about other ways of understanding nature through cultural, spiritual, you know, a whole kind of different set of ties, you know, and it's something, you know, that I think, you know, that, you know, is very appealing to certain segments of the American population. And, you know, Stephen Kellert did a lot of work looking at attitudes, values, and beliefs of American society about the environment. And I think his surveys, like in the mid 1990s, found about 9 or 10 different types of values there. And there's some people who are more utilitarian, and there's some that are more maybe ecological or and like that. But one of the things, the trends they're looking at more, you know, industrialized societies is that, and post-industrial societies is that they become more biophilic in nature because people moving in cities, they have a different relationship to the like countryside where they're not, their life in their way of life isn't, you know, economic especially, is not tied to it. And so they're looking for recreation and, you know, holidays and things like that. And I remember there was a paper published out of the Netherlands, probably about 20 years about that. And so there's a trend of that biophilic, and you can also, you want to say which societies, like probably like Western societies, because there are very different values in the different countries of the world. And so, but I think it's a positive trend to say that we are becoming more biophilic, but there's still a long way to go. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there particular projects or efforts in Twin Cities that you would really recommend people check out? Maybe like the daylighting of the Creek project or like that?
Sure, yeah. You know, there's a lot of different projects, and just thinking off like the whole effort with the Failing Creek watershed, you know, you think of like Bruce Vento, you know, it's a neat place to go to because they do spring burnings there of the grasses. And, you know, it's interesting to see that shows a different relationship between structure and function. And I think having those alternative practices can be very valuable. You know, and, you know, there was a, you know, yeah, there's that's one that kind of pops in my mind, but there's so many others, you know, that are out there, you know, and like in New York City, there's like the High Line, you know, trying to work more biodiverse landscapes, you know, and I think there's been also a lot of ecological restoration projects done in different parks. You know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, what should our parkland, what are the uses, and maybe changing others, you know, some parts of the park landscape to something else, like the Lake Hiawatha golf course and things like that. But of course, there are people who, you know, they can look at the same landscape and see something different there. And there's a different lens and background experience bringing to that. And so one way is, you know, how do you work with people to come up with a solution that, you know, works for everyone, not only people, but also biodiversity. And sometimes they call that like multi-species justice or multi-species sustainability. You know, that hasn't been common in planning and designing parks. It's almost like really focused on people, which isn't surprising, but we can also have habitats there. There's been some work in that area with like Minneapolis and St. Paul parks and other, you know, park departments, and, you know, trying to consider, but it's something that kind of stretches the imagination some to say, how do we bring the voices of other species into this conversation? And so I think things like the bird collisions to buildings is a good way, urban agriculture, yeah, there's just a lot, or seeing like turkeys all over the Minneapolis campus and they're roosting, I think people are fascinated by wildlife. And I think if we can look at the positive kinds of interactions, that's good, because there's also negative interactions, and not everything is positive. And, if people have deer who eat their gardens and they can't quite keep them away, there's things like that. Or, it's kind of the whole urban wildlife issue, because not everything is going to be positive. There's some negative things. But any other questions? Yes.
Do you think it's realistic that in cities we'd be able to restructure it in a way that encourages walking and buses rather than driving everywhere? Because I know, like, obviously this is a much larger scale than in Europe, but like in Europe, they really prioritize being able to walk everywhere. And I think because we've kind of taken that away, it also plays a really big part in our ability to connect with people, because we just go from one destination to the other, and there's no like, there's just nothing in between where there's a chance to talk to people or anything. So do you think it's like realistic that we'd be able to restructure this to encourage walking places?
We should be able to, like, if you look at the active living literature in urban planning, there's been quite a bit of work done. And also just looking at, there's different, planning and design trends, but walkable communities, that would be one of the ones that's very popular, or transit-oriented development. Those are things that look at using public transportation and really trying to get people to walk out, considering urban neighborhoods as, places that are more pedestrian oriented. And, one of the layers of just good biophilic design is, having places that are less automobile oriented, because that means you can reduce the amount of impervious surfaces. And that's been, I know more about the Minneapolis campus. They've been active in reducing the amount of road area, or trying to create, like the Church Street has the pedestrian mall. So they really have been making some progress to create the campus so it's more pedestrian friendly. But those kinds of practices can also be good for like stormwater management, but also biodiversity, things like that. And so, and also allowing like the living labs projects going in with, the different, like pollinator gardens and things like that, or rain gardens, just trying to diversify the campus landscape matrix. It helps, and people get used to it. And I think people like to see, especially with rain gardens, usually have pretty nice flowers and things like that. And, I think it's realistic to say about walkable communities. And one of the images I showed was at Village Homes in Davis, California. And it's one of the original like sustainable design communities that was planned in the 1970s, and not really, and it was, kind of a grassroots effort. And that one is one of the best kind of walkable communities and less automobile oriented. Like the streets are narrower, there's like public green space, the lot sizes are smaller, so there's more public space. There's people have like community gardens there, but also their own gardens, and they're also like little orchards and things like that, like edible landscapes. And so it's just, I think some of that has, happened in the Twin Cities, and in terms of like little orchards or community, of course, there's been community gardens and things. And I think there's a sense of trying to diversify that matrix with plants. And so I think some of these practices I talk about go hand in hand, like with walkable communities and less, automobile dependent societies, and trying, and also to think about reducing our carbon footprint and things like that. And, I think it's one of those things where, what should the landscapes like 10 or 20 or 30 years look like, and how should they be maintained in order to, for them to be sustainable and resilient, but also to, think about intergenerational equity, and saying, do the practices today, are they the best ones to help? Sometimes people say 7 generations out, to say, is there, simple things we can, if we project even a generation out, to say, if we have better knowledge and information, if we manage and maintain our landscapes or design, plan them differently, could there be some things that help for the next generation, to reduce carbon? And I think there is some of that. I think it's a real challenge to change our lifestyles, but if we do change them, it will benefit someone in the future, and, and creating a more habitable planet in this kind of, sixth extinction, which is scary on this, to think about that. And because it seems like things are kind of holding, but, I think we worry about systems thinking, and do we hit the tipping points and thresholds? And if we can figure those out, I think they're really critical. And I think if people knew them and we could project out in the future with better accuracy and bring that information back, I think it could help put things in perspective better about, climate adaptation and, warming climates.
Yeah, and just from what you just said, that reminded me of, how we never have fruit trees in public spaces, but that would really encourage people to go out or just want to walk on the street, because they can just, like an apple tree, like normalizing having fruit trees everywhere, or like, berry bushes. I know we have that on St. Paul campus, and that's like, I think that's a really good way of getting people to like interact with each other more, and just encourage wanting to have more plant-based urban structures.
Sure. Yes. And so really that essence is that human plant interaction. And what's that doorway in to get people to think differently? It's got the greenness, but then there's some other complexity there. So greenness really is an entry. And so when people talk to me about their home yards, how they take care of them and things, I really like that, because that's someone who's probably, they really like gardening or tending their lawn. They've got the care thing. We just have to think about, how are they caring, and maybe saying, would you be willing to adopt some different practices? And that's where incentives come in, and helping volunteering and helping people understand some of the complexities when you it's not like you can't have lawn, it's just like how much of the lawn, and can you get people to convert some of it, and saying, yeah, it could be lower maintenance, but people, I think the knowledge about plants, it's one of those things to also help them to understand that there are alternatives, and also some of this, changing lawn can also address some practical problems, like, the lawn that will grow under the shade tree, wet areas in a yard. Those are all little signs to help them understand sort of the ecology of their yards. And so I think for those people who like the gardening and tending their, green acre or 0.25 acre, or a little bit, or just a courtyard or a balcony, what can we do with that? Because the human plant interaction can happen at very small scales, like, people have house plants, and, it can be interior experiences, especially now that a lot of people rent, not everybody has balconies. So we have to be creative when we think about human plant relationships. Those are great questions. You guys are smart. Oh, there's one more question.
Coming from agriculturally dominated kind of state, I'm curious to get your thoughts on how maybe monoculture in general in these big agricultural states or landscapes can also kind of apply to this idea of urbanization. It's common to see a lawn that is completely mowed, and then the only thing opposite that lawn are big cornfields or something.
Sure.
I couldn't help but see the parallels between some of this.
Yeah, they're both landscapes that are cultivated. They have a lot of cultivation practices. And so for farmers, I came from farming on one side of the family, farming family. And, there people are trying to make their livelihoods, and it's not easy to be a farmer. There's especially a small farmer, because farms have had to get a lot larger, and there's the whole economy of that. And so, there are parallels, because farming requires a pretty complex physical infrastructure. and how the fields are managed, and it's actually very high tech too. And I think that it's something where I think it depends on the farmer. You know, are they open to that? And again, it's thinking about practices and incentives. And, you know, I think that there's like the Conservation Reserve Program. You know, there's different incentive programs that I think can help, like green payments, that can help farmers make that conversion, because sometimes, you know, the profit margins are very tight and it depends a lot on the weather, and, you know, it's not easy being a farmer. They really are at the whims of the weather. And like, look at the winter we have, you know, it's very, you know, very unusual. There's not that snowpack. You know, we might get it, you know, sometimes we get freaky snowstorms in February, March, or April, but it's definitely, you know, not what we've expected, at least so far. It's going to be 50 next week, they say. And it was like 54 on Christmas in Minneapolis. It was just kind of wild. And I grew up in zone 5. And so I can tell you we're experiencing a January thaw right now. I grew up in the Buffalo area. We get more snow there because of the lake effect, but you know, it is behaving kind of like a zone 5, but the kind of the 50s, you know, that's pretty warm, but it's usually will be cooler. But you know, at least in Minneapolis, I've seen if it's zone 5, there's still more variation. It gets colder and still can get warmer. And I think it's because of the continental climate, you know, where Buffalo is like on the lake. And so it moderates some of that. It's not so much of a broad bandwidth. So, but it's interesting to be able to grow different plants here, and, you know, and over time, and how do we help people understand that transition? We could also grow different things. You know, all of a sudden crops more, you know, south, if you think about like maybe southern Iowa or Missouri, you know, Missouri. It's, you know, it's not out of the imagination when you think of 2100 or something like that. So. Great questions. Yes.
I don't know if you're having more time, but I've just been thinking a lot about the ideas, the term you mentioned, museification.
Yes.
Because I haven't heard it in this context, but I've definitely in ecology and like conservation science classes talked about like a natural park effect, where like people are like, oh, well, these plants and animals are protected here in this space, so we don't need to worry about it. But in actuality, there's migration routes and there's edge effects and there's all these things. And so like just saying that like we had set aside this chunk of land for everything else and then the rest of the land is for us people, that can be problematic. And I'm just curious if it's like relational to that.
Yeah.
I just want to know a little more about that.
And yes, and so it gets into the idea of, you know, E.O. Wilson's half Earth. You know, how can we protect the other half of the earth for the web of life and biodiversity? And so I know one of the goals is, you know, when we think about Minnesota, there's quite a bit of gradient there. There's more like in the western and southern part where it's more agriculturally oriented. There you probably have 95 to 97% of the land farmed. And so the question is, you know, can you set aside, you know, 10 or 20%? I know I've heard that kind of 20% number in landscapes that are more, that are privately owned. But you know, up in northern Minnesota, there's more public land. So that half earth isn't, you know, you could get that with the public land. And so the question is, you know, how do you set that aside? And I think that's where thinking about the private land matrix and trying to get people to influence them to think about human-plant relations in a different way could make some headway, especially as the climate warms. And people see it, I think, you know, these kind of the phenology of seasons and what, you know, birds come in, or that kind of freaky spring we had in 2012 where the trees were blooming and in spring break and all, they leafed out very early. And you could actually see that in satellite images of, you know, looking at, you know, like NDVI and the greenness, you know, like a green plume coming up through the northern, from Texas up to the northern plains because of the photosynthetic activity. And I think as these things, more events happen in the local scale where people understand, I think that's a doorway open to conversations about, you know, they'll get concerned about future generations and what should we do. And so that question comes in about tipping points. And but tipping points can also be leverage points. And so how do we work with that? And so it's gets back to you, I'm sure you've heard it many times, like wicked problems, and no one discipline can solve these things.
Excellent discussion. Thank you all for your questions and participation. Any questions online? Are we set?
Great, thank you so much
Thank
for
you
your
so much.
attention. Thanks for the invitation.